Today's lesson is a brief history of blood transfusions. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to talk about blood and blood transfusions. No, we're not talking about the blood transfusions that happen when a vampire bites your neck. We're actually talking about blood transfusions that are supposed to help people. And maybe you've donated blood yourself, or at least you've received blood in a transfusion. Has that ever happened to you, Helen?
Yes, I have tried to give blood in the past. So we're talking about blood transfusions. A transfusion is basically a medical procedure where one person gives blood to another person, or blood from one person is put into another person's body. And I have given my blood to organizations in the past that collect blood to give to people who need blood, but I have never received a blood transfusion, luckily, so far.
Indeed. So you might need a blood transfusion if you have a serious accident or something like that. So it's a good idea to donate blood once in a while to help people who need that blood. And today, of course, we're talking about the history of blood transfusions. So let's get to it, everybody. Let's read the introductory paragraph right now, and then we'll talk about it.
A brief history of blood transfusions. Each year, around 108 million blood donations are collected from selfless people around the world. These donations are used for blood transfusions, which have saved countless lives and improved the quality of life of many more. And while these generous donors should not be overlooked, neither should the people who paved the way for the procedure itself.
大家好，第一部分我们可以看到单字 donation。它是名词，指的是捐赠物、捐赠或是捐献。例如 The donation the company made to an environmental charity was considered a symbolic gesture by critics. 该公司捐款给环保慈善机构，被批评人士视为象征之举。或者 For every $100 donation that you give, a family of 4 will be fed for a month. 你所捐赠的每100美元将会让一个4口之家温饱1个月。另外补充这个字的动词 donate, D-O-N-A-T-E, donate, 意思是捐赠或是捐献。像是 The restaurant donated unused food to a homeless shelter. 那间餐厅将没有使用的食物捐给一所游民之家。又或者是Lawrence feels he has a moral obligation to donate some of his salary to charity.Lawrence 觉得自己有道德上的责任，要捐部分薪水给慈善机构。
So diving right into the first sentence of today's lesson, it says, each year, around 108 million blood donations are collected from selfless people around the world. So in other words, there are many people around the world who are selfless. That is, people who think about other people before themselves. And these people often donate blood.To be more precise, there are around 108 million blood donations collected from these people. A donation is the process of giving blood or a part of your body to help someone who needs it. You can also collect donations in money or in goods that are given to people in need.
Yep, the verb is to donate. So, of course, if you're a good person or if you have some free time, you can donate blood. I believe I've seen these special kinds of vehicles in Taiwan parked in various places where you can go in and donate blood. I'm sure if you go to your local hospital and offer to donate blood, they will figure something out right there. So, donate is the verb and donation is the noun. That's when you give the blood, you make a donation. And yes, indeed, lots of people donate blood all around the world every year. Now, these donations are used for blood transfusions, which have saved countless lives and improved the quality of life of many more. So there's the word transfusion there. It's in the title. Basically, it's most often used when we talk about this procedure, blood transfusions. I can't really think of any other place that we actually use this word transfusion. So it's basically referring to when blood is collected from a donor and then they store it in the hospital until somebody needs it. So it's going from one person to another, as Helen said earlier.
Yes, and while these generous donors should not be overlooked, neither should the people who paved the way for the procedure itself. So here we have the word donor. A donor is somebody who gives a donation of something. So it refers to the person who donates. And while we should thank these donors, these people who give their own blood, we should also think about those people who made this procedure of blood transfusions possible. So a procedure is a way of doing something. We often talk about medical procedures such as operations or some kind of treatment that you have to get at the hospital. You might say, well, how long is this procedure going to last? How long do I have to be at the hospital? And the nurse or doctor might reply, this entire procedure should take no longer than half an hour.
Indeed. So not only should we not overlook the contributions of blood donors, but we should also not overlook the people who paved the way for this procedure. In other words, we should recognize the contribution of both donors and the people in the past who made this procedure possible. And let's talk about this procedure in the next part of our lesson. It's quite long, so buckle down, hunker down, and listen carefully to what we have to say.
Research into blood transfusion dates back to 1628, when a British doctor named William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood. Soon after, people began experimenting with transfusing blood between animals. The first to succeed was another British doctor named Richard Lower, who in 1665 bled a dog almost to death before reviving it with the blood of another dog. Attempts to transfuse animal blood into humans were less successful, and patients often died. It wasn't until 1667 that a successful human blood transfusion was performed. Jean-Baptiste Denis, who was doctor to King Louis XIV of France, managed to transfuse the blood of a sheep into a 15-year-old boy and later into an adult man, both of whom survived. The lack of an allergic reaction in these patients was likely due to the small amount of blood that was transfused. However, Denis' third patient died after receiving several transfusions of cow blood. The first human-to-human blood transfusion took place in 1818. In an attempt to treat a patient who had suffered extreme blood loss during childbirth, British doctor James Blundell transfused blood into the woman, using her husband as a donor. Between 1825 and 1830, he performed another 10 transfusions, half of which were successful. A firm believer in the procedure, Blundell published his results and invented a number of instruments for the transfusion of blood.
第二部分我们看到片语 date back to， 意思是追溯到或是回溯到某个年代、时期或是事件。举例来说， That country's peach festival dates back 200 years to the early 1800s. 那个国家的蜜桃节可追溯到200年前，也就是19世纪早期。又或者说 This building dates back to the late 19th century. 这座建筑建于19世纪末。再来，我们看到动词 revive， 指的是使恢复生机、使苏醒或是使复苏。例如 Nurses revived the patient after he lost consciousness. 护士把失去意识的病人救醒了。或是 Broadway often revives musicals that were previously popular with audiences. 百老汇常常重新演出过去很受观众喜爱的音乐剧。接着我们看到单字 publish， 它是动词，意思是发表、出版、公布或是发行。举例来说 Jan's articles have been published in several magazines. Jan 的文章已经发表在好几本杂志上了。又或者是 Sue was excited to see her article published in the newspaper. Sue 看到自己的文章被刊在报纸上，感到很兴奋。另外，在这个字的字尾加上 er， 就会变成名词 publisher， 指的是出版者或是出版社。像是 The author sent the first draft of his new novel to the publisher for review. 那位作家把他的新小说初稿寄给出版社审阅。
Blood transfusions today might seem like a very normal procedure, but there was a time when it was considered to be quite unusual or quite shocking. Now, it says here, research into blood transfusion dates back to 1628 when a British doctor named William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood.
Indeed. So here we've got the phrase to date back to. That just means we go back in time to an earlier date, and that's when this thing came about. It's when it began. So yes, indeed, you can say, oh, this skeleton dates back to the Stone Age. This person must have lived during the Stone Age. The skeleton dates back to the Stone Age. And blood transfusion dates back to the year 1628. We've got a British doctor in the UK named William Harvey, and he discovered the circulation of blood. Interesting. Before that, people did not know that blood circulates through the body. It moves through all parts of the body. People didn't know that before 1628, and soon after, people began experimenting with transfusing blood between animals. So here we've got the word transfuse being used as a verb. So they started to experiment with animals at first, because if you experiment with people, it's kind of dangerous.
Yes, and the first to succeed was another British doctor named Richard Lower, who in 1665 bled a dog almost to death before reviving it with the blood of another dog. So this other doctor, Richard Lower, bled a dog. So to bleed means to remove or draw blood from somebody or some animal. And bled is the past tense of to bleed. So bleed here is being used in a transitive sense, to bleed a dog, to bleed a person. So this doctor in 1665 bled a dog almost to death, which means that he drew blood from the dog until the dog almost died because the dog's body did not have enough blood in it to survive. However, the doctor was able to revive the dog with the blood of another dog. So to revive here means to make somebody or to make an animal become conscious or alive again, to bring back to life or to bring from the brink of death. And how did he do this? He gave the blood of another dog to this dog that he had bled.
And it saved the life of the dog. He was able to revive the dog. So here the verb to revive just means to restore life, to restore someone to life after they've collapsed or maybe even died. That might be possible as well. But here, of course, the other dog was revived with the blood of another dog. And attempts to transfuse animal blood into humans were less successful, and patients often died. You can imagine animal blood and human blood aren't the same thing. Maybe they'll work sometimes, maybe they won't work at other times. So they weren't so successful when trying to transfuse blood from animals to humans. And yes, those patients often died during these experiments. Now let's go on to the next paragraph here. It says, it wasn't until 1667 that a successful human blood transfusion was performed. So it wasn't until a certain date that something else happened. So in other words, we had to wait until the year 1667 when there was a successful blood transfusion in people, in humans.
That's right. You can also substitute a date with another event that happened. It wasn't until something happened that something else happened. So you could say, for instance, it wasn't until the train had already closed its doors that John realized he had missed his stop. So what happened in the year 1667? Well, Jean-Baptiste Denis, who was doctor to King Louis XIV of France, managed to transfuse the blood of a sheep into a 15-year-old boy and later into an adult man, both of whom survived.
Okay, so this happened in France. We've got a French doctor, and he was the official doctor to the king there. He was able to transfuse the blood of a sheep into a 15-year-old boy and later into an adult man. And it says both of whom survived. Both of these patients survived because of that blood transfusion. Now, here in the next sentence, it says, the lack of an allergic reaction in these patients was likely due to the small amount of blood that was transfused. So here we've got something called an allergic reaction. An allergy is something that you have in your body that makes you have a reaction to certain substances. Many people have allergies to pollen in the air or to cat fur, for example, or to rat feces or something like that. You might have an allergy to those. More commonly, we say you are allergic to something. Oh, I can't go into your house because I'm allergic to cats, and you have several cats there. I will just start sneezing uncontrollably if I go into your house. And yes, these patients did not have an allergic reaction, probably because there wasn't very much blood used in the transfusion. If they had used more, perhaps they would have had an allergic reaction.
That's right. However, Denis' third patient died after receiving several transfusions of cow blood. So the third patient of Dr. Denis wasn't so lucky as his first two patients because perhaps he received more of the animal's blood, and having more foreign blood or an animal's blood in his system, the patient died perhaps due to an allergic reaction.
Okay, now we move forward in time from the year 1667 to 1818, and the first human-to-human blood transfusion took place in 1818. We could also use the previous pattern. It wasn't until 1818 that the first human-to-human blood transfusion took place. So that's when a human was able to move blood from his or her body to another person's body with the help of a doctor. That took place in the year 1818, still during the Qing dynasty.
So in the year 1818, a British doctor stepped in and he was trying to save a patient. In an attempt to treat a patient who had suffered extreme blood loss during childbirth, British doctor James Blundell transfused blood into the woman using her husband as a donor. So in this case, the patient was a woman who was losing a lot of blood during childbirth. Childbirth refers to the process of giving birth to a baby. And in the past, quite honestly, also in the present, women who give birth put themselves in a lot of danger often, and the loss of blood is a common situation. So this doctor stepped in, James Blundell, and he transfused the woman's husband's blood into the woman.
Okay, and between 1825 and 1830, he performed another 10 transfusions, half of which were successful, and I guess the other half were not successful. They were failures. A firm believer in the procedure, Blundell published his results and invented a number of instruments for the transfusion of blood. So he was confident that this procedure would work most of the time, so he published his results. He wrote an article, and it was printed in a magazine, probably a medical journal, and people could read about it. And he also invented several instruments that would help with the procedure. Well, now it's time for us to move on to the third and final part. Let's listen.
Despite holding great promise, blood transfusions were regarded as dangerous and were largely shunned until the early 20th century. With Karl Landsteiner's discovery of 3 human blood groups in 1901, however, attitudes began to change. Blood transfusion now had a solid scientific basis and became much safer as a result. A year later, the 4th blood group was discovered, and within a decade, the compatibility of patient and donor blood could be determined before the procedure. Today, blood transfusion is extremely safe, and this common procedure is viewed as nothing less than a lifesaver.
最后我们看到片语 nothing less than， 它的意思是完全是点点点，或是简直不亚于点点点。我们可以说 Julie's pie was nothing less than extraordinary. Julie 做的派简直太美味了。也可以说 His musical ability is nothing less than phenomenal. 他的音乐天分简直可说是惊世骇俗。
As we saw in the last part, Dr. James Blundell was doing quite a few blood transfusions. He did 10 transfusions between 1825 and 1830, but only half of them were successful. Now, despite holding great promise, blood transfusions were regarded as dangerous and were largely shunned until the early 20th century. In other words, blood transfusions seemed to be a procedure that could save a lot of lives. However, still, a lot of people died as a result of transfusions, and that is why a lot of people, doctors, the medical community, shunned this procedure. To shun something means to avoid something. You could also shun a person. So to shun means to avoid a person or a thing on purpose.
For example, I could say, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer was shunned by the other reindeer because of his shiny nose. And of course, this procedure was shunned because it wasn't really certain. It worked half of the time. So they didn't really pay attention to this theory until the early 20th century, which would be the 1900s, with Karl Landsteiner's discovery of 3 human blood groups in 1901, which would be, of course, blood types. However, attitudes began to change. People started to have new feelings about blood transfusions. Blood transfusion now had a solid scientific basis and became much safer as a result. Of course, you need to know a person's blood type in order to perform a blood transfusion. We now know that.
That's right. So before, people didn't know if someone who received a blood transfusion was going to survive or not. It seemed like a game of chance. But now, with the discovery of 3 human blood groups, people were more sure about whether a transfusion was going to go right or not. Now, a year later, after Karl Landsteiner's discovery of 3 human blood groups, the 4th blood group was discovered, and within a decade, the compatibility of patient and donor blood could be determined before the procedure.
Right, so we talk about compatibility, how well things get along. We could use this if we talk about people being compatible in the office. Do they get along well? And the compatibility, of course, is the noun form, and compatible is the adjective. So, of course, we need to have compatibility with the patient and with the donor. And, of course, this is because we know what the blood type is, along with other factors. And today, blood transfusion is extremely safe, and this common procedure is viewed as nothing less than a lifesaver. A lifesaver is something that saves a life. You could describe lots of things as a lifesaver. You could say, for example, you were working late at the office, but one of your coworkers helped you finish the job, and you could say, "Oh, you're a real lifesaver. I was never going to be able to finish this by myself."
Yes, and from a medical standpoint, you can also say that antibiotics are lifesavers because before antibiotics came along, or penicillin, things like that, people often died from what today have become very common diseases. So here we also have the phrase nothing less than, and you can use this phrase for emphasizing how important or how serious something is. You could say, for instance, that Mary is nothing less than the perfect friend because she is generous and she always listens to other people's problems. So she is nothing less than a perfect friend.
You could substitute the word totally. It's totally a lifesaver. It's nothing less than a lifesaver. And yes, indeed, we have the work of all these famous doctors to thank for being able to have blood transfusions nowadays. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation. Here comes Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 今天要来练习篇章结构的题型。那我们先来看4个选项的句子。 A 选项是 The lack of an allergic reaction in these patients was likely due to the small amount of blood that was transfused。 这个句子在解释这些病患没有过敏反应的原因可能是……那特别注意关键词在于 these patients， 表示这前方的叙述应该会提到一些病患哦。那么 B 选项 Between 1825 1825 and 1830, he performed another 10 transfusions, half of which were successful. 这个句子提供了时间线索是1825年到1830年之间，那要特别注意文章的时间顺序哦。还有这边的 he 指的是谁呢？然后他又执行了10次的 transfusions。好 ，C 选项他说 The first to succeed was another British doctor named Richard Lower, who in 1665 bled a dog almost to death.Before reviving it with the blood of another dog. 好，这边提到说，第一个成功的是另一位英国医生，名叫 Richard Lower。那这边有一个时间线索是1665年，他所做的事情就是跟狗狗的放血输血有关。好，再来 D 选项，他说 ，Despite holding great promise.Blood transfusions were regarded as dangerous and were largely shunned until the early 20th century. 那这边的时间线索是 until the early 20th century, 一直到20世纪初期。Blood transfusions 仍被视为危险的点。这意味着在这个时间点之后啊，看法应该会有所改变咯。好，那同学们一开始在看选项的时候，如果你不知道 transfuse 或是 transfusion 的意思也没关系，其实在文章里面多少都可以看出一些端倪。像文章一开始他就谈到捐血，他说 These donations are used for blood transfusions, which have saved countless lives. 这些捐的血是用于 blood transfusions, 拯救了无数的生命。那是不是就可以推测出 blood transfusions 应该就是输血嘛？输血用来救命嘛？所以补充一下哦 ，transfuse 这个动词就可以表达输血的输，那么 transfusion 这个名词就可以表达输血输液。好，接着我们来看题目吧。第一题呢，我们看到第一个空格所在的段落是从1628年开始讲起，他就提到 blood transfusion 的研究可以追溯到1628年，当时一位英国医生发现了血液的循环，那么之后人们就开始了跟动物有关的实验。我们从时间序和动物这两个线索可以推断答案要选 C。 他说第一个成功的是另外一名名叫 Richard Lower 的英国医生，他在1665年将一只狗放血至奄奄一息后，再以另一只狗的血液使它恢复生机。好，我们看到第二题，第二空格呢所在的段落是在1667年开始讲起的，他有提到一名医生成功把一只绵羊的血输给一名15岁的男孩，之后再输给一名成年男子，那他们两个都有存活下来。好，空格后面却提到说第3名病患却在输了好几次牛血之后死亡。我们可以推论空格可能是在说明造成输血结果不同的可能原因，而且我们先前就有提到说选项 A 它是有关键词 these patients 这些病患，那最适合答案应该就是 A 这些病患没有过敏反应，很可能是因为输血量很少。好，第3题我们看到第3个空格所在的段落是从1818年开始讲起，空格前面提到第一次人对人的输血是在1818年，那为了治疗分娩而大量失血的妇女，英国医生 James Blundell 以这位妇女的丈夫作为捐赠者来为她输血。那么空格后面继续提到 James Blundell 出版研究成果发明输血工具等等，我们从语义跟时间序可以推知答案要选 B。 在1825年到1830年之间，他又执行了10次输血，其中有一半成功。那我们看到选项里面代名词 he 其实指的就是 James Blundell。 好，再来看到第4题，我们看到第4个空格是出现在最后一段第一句，它有可能是可以作为结论的内容。好，我们看到空格下一句他说在1901年发现了3种人类血型，看法就开始改变了，输血现在有确凿的科学根据，因而变得更加安全。那从这句呢，我们可以推断最适合答案是 D。尽管可能会有成效，但输血一直到20世纪初期仍被视为危险，且大多会被刻意避免。这个选项它除了有关键的时间 until the early 20th century 之外，内容呢也跟下一句呈现互相对照，符合语义哦。好，那么以上是今天的讲解，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Donation. Mrs. Jones made a generous donation to the animal shelter. Procedure.The operation to treat the old man's back pain was a relatively common medical procedure. Publish. After the professor published her paper, many important issues were raised. Lifesaver. Early detection of any disease can be a lifesaver. Allergic. The little girl had a severe allergic reaction to the bee sting. Revive. After the basketball player fainted, it took the team doctor several minutes to revive him.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoy reading along with us. I am Helen.
I am Roger.
See you next time.